welcome to another exciting episode of URL podcast, Unzip, Reboot, and Leave. Today, we have someone who has done PhD in Asian Studies from Griffith University. He was one of the only three Indian students awarded a bilateral scholarship by Indian government in 1982 to pursue postgraduate studies in China. And because of that, he studied Chinese politics and economy from Peking University. He is an academic fellow, regional relationships at Australia India Institute, University of Melbourne, and a senior lecturer in the same uni. Please welcome Pradeep Taneja. How are you today, sir?
I'm very well, thank you, Gautam.
So today, mainly we will talk about your expertise, which is Chinese influence in geopolitics, Chinese influence overall in the world. Let's say because we are in Australia, we will talk in Australia. We are Indian, so we will talk about India and US. Definitely, we have to, and overall the global, like cross-border relationships and all. Okay. So on that, the first question is how this Trump 2.0, okay, will influence or already influencing or already influenced strategic calculations between in China India, China US, and China Australia.
A good question, Gautam. I think it's a very difficult question to answer. Difficult question to answer because Trump, we know from his last time when he was in the White House, Trump can be very unpredictable because Trump is not driven by any particular coherent set of principles or ideology. When a leader is motivated by a particular set of ideas and has a coherent, set of beliefs, it makes it easier to predict how they might behave and how they might influence international affairs. And certainly the President of the United States has a huge influence on what happens in the world, largely because of the sheer power of the United States. It is, after all, the world's largest economy and the world's does create challenges for world leaders, whether it's in India or China or Australia or the European Union, the NATO partners of the United States, for example, because it is difficult to predict how Trump might behave, how he might respond to a particular situation. So let's look at, for example, let's start with Australia, because we are both based in Australia, and Australia starts with letter A. So let's start with Australia. Australian leadership was not quite sure when Trump got elected in November. Australian leadership wasn't sure what his attitude is going to be on AUKUS. AUKUS, the Australia, UK, United States, the new alliance, which was announced when Scott Morrison was the Prime Minister of Australia. And one of the key elements of AUKUS is that Australia would be able to initially source and later on build in Australia nuclear-powered submarines with the help of the United States and the United Kingdom. Now, historically, Australia's position has been that Australia has no nuclear industry. Australia doesn't support nuclear power, and therefore there was no question of Australia acquiring nuclear submarines. The last set of submarines built in Australia were the Collins-class submarines, which were built with Swedish technology, with Swedish help. But Australian government under Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister at the time, decided that Australia would cancel the contract that Australia already had with France to build conventional submarines. In their place, Scott Morrison struck a deal with President Biden and then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson at the time that Australia would get help from the US and the UK in acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. Now, there's a difference between nuclear weapon-carrying submarines and nuclear-powered submarines. Australian submarines will not have nuclear weapons because Australia has no plans to develop nuclear weapons, but they will be nuclear-powered. And nuclear-powered submarines would be able to have a much longer reach, and they would be able to operate in more distant areas for much longer than conventional submarines can operate. So Australian government, during Scott Morrison's time in office, decided that we are going to get these nuclear submarines from the United States and the UK, and the details were to be worked out later on. And because the Biden administration was the one which agreed to this deal, there was speculation whether Trump, if he came to the White House again, whether he would respect that deal. And until today, the Australian government wasn't quite sure whether the incoming Trump administration would respect the deal which was signed by Scott Morrison and the Biden administration. And of course, the Labour Party, which was in opposition at the time, agreed to support the deal. So although Labour Party came to power in 2022, they have continued to negotiate on the deal with the United States and United Kingdom. So in other words, the AUKUS deal in Australia has bipartisan support. Both the coalition and the Labour Party, which is in power now, they both support AUKUS. Now, until yesterday, when Trump's nominee for the job of Defense Secretary, when he was facing Senate hearing for his confirmation, he in fact said that that Australia is an important ally and he would support AUKUS. So this gives us first indication of Trump administration's attitude to AUKUS. So this morning I saw Prime Minister Albanese on television addressing a news conference, and he was asked about AUKUS, and you could see a sense of relief that the Trump administration would support AUKUS because Australia has committed significant resources. Australia's defense planning is now based on the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines. So if the Trump administration were to scrap the deal, it would leave Australia in a very difficult position. So from Australia's point of view, now we have some clarity. But other countries, if we go in the alphabetical order, let's take China. China also faces the same dilemma. China and the China-United States relationship has been complicated. United States, about a decade ago, decided that it would treat China as a strategic competitor, that China is no longer just a partner. China is now a strategic competitor. So the official terminology in the United States has been that China is a competitor, that China wants to overtake the United States as the world's largest economy and as the world's largest military power. In other words, if the United States is the global hegemon now, that China wants to replace the United States as the regional and global hegemon. So the United States government's policy towards China has been that we can't afford to let that happen, that the United States would do everything to deter China from seeking parity or overtaking the United States as the world's greatest power. And one of the areas which is the most concerning area for the United States has been how quickly China has been able to develop new technologies, whether it is in artificial intelligence, in computing, quantum computing in particular, and robotics. These are some of the areas in which the United States is worried that China has been closing the gap much faster than anyone imagined. And now the official policy in the United States is that we would not allow China to get access to cutting-edge United States or Western technology, which would enable China to close that gap. So this has become a very strong focus of the United States policy, and United States is now determined to deny China access to the cutting edge latest technology. And United States and its allies, such as European countries and Australia, are now committed to prevent China acquiring these technologies. Now, China acquired these technologies in many different ways. China acquired these technologies by sending their PhD students to high technology labs in some of the top universities in the United States, in Europe, and Australia. And they were able to get that technology, take it back to China, and China was able to develop those technologies further. To give you one example, China has become the world's largest producer of solar panels. Some of the most advanced solar panels are made in China. The whole world, in fact, is dependent on importing solar panels from China because, almost every major country has made a commitment to go to net zero, carbon emissions, and they are feverishly developing alternative energy technology, including solar power, wind power, and others. In solar power, the whole world seems to be dependent on China because China is the most cost-effective producer of high-tech solar panels, photovoltaic, panels.
Yes.
And where did China get the technology from? It came through Chinese PhD students coming to study, coming to work in labs at the University of New South Wales in Australia. University of New South Wales had some of the most advanced research in solar technology. And Chinese students in the 1980s and 90s were welcomed with open arms to come and work in these labs. And some of these students, after graduating with a PhD degree, went back to China. One of them in particular set up one of China's first high-tech solar panel manufacturing factory company. And he became a billionaire entrepreneur. And he was followed by other Chinese PhD students. And China became, a high-tech producer of photovoltaic, panels, solar panels. Now, this would not be possible. Now, Chinese PhD students are not able to get admission and get entry to labs, whether it's in the US or in Australia or in Europe, in labs which are experimenting with or developing high technologies, advanced technologies. So the United States now has a policy that we cannot afford to allow China to become essentially the world's leader in many of these new technology areas, because that will leave the United States way behind if China continues to develop technologies the way it has done in solar power, the way it has done in artificial intelligence, and the way it has done in quantum computing. So Trump administration is going to be even tougher on China when it comes to access to American technology. So there are two areas, I think, in which Trump administration is going to be very tough on China. One is trade. China recently announced its foreign trade figures for 2024. And you'll be shocked to know that China's trade surplus in 2024 is almost $1 trillion US. $1 trillion US. I don't think any country has ever had a $1 trillion trade surplus with the rest of the world. So Trump administration is going to essentially, as he has said, he said he will impose 60% tariff on Chinese product. He may not impose 60% tariff, but certainly Trump administration is going to be very tough on trade with China. He's certainly going to impose tariffs on Chinese product, different types of products. He will force the Chinese government to negotiate deals with China, with the United States. So trade is one area where China is going to face a very tough time with the Trump administration. Remember, trade is very important for China. China's exports have grown, particularly in the December month of 2024. China's exports grew 20% as Chinese companies tried to sell as much to America as they could before the Trump administration takes office. But overall, China's trade with the United States in 2024 grew by about 4.6%. So that's still a significant growth. And the reason why the US market is so important for Chinese companies and for the Chinese economy is because Chinese economy has not been able to generate enough domestic demand to continue to grow, to continue to create new jobs. For China to become a developed country, China will have to have a strong domestic demand. But because of unemployment, because of uncertainty about China's own economic future, China's domestic demand is not growing. For a long time, ever since China began its economic reforms in the late 1970s, China's GDP growth was driven by two things. One was domestic investment, particularly government investment, public investment in infrastructure, in new industrial zones, new economic zones, and all kinds of state-owned companies being given extra capital by the state and state-owned banks to invest in manufacturing and other things. The second area of China's GDP growth was exports. China became the factory of the world. When China began its economic reforms in 1978, China's total foreign trade was only about $4 billion. And as I said, in 2024, China had a trade surplus of $1 trillion. So Trump administration is going to be tough on both, on technology exports to China, China's access to American technology, and secondly, on trade. It is going to take tough measures on trade. So for China, Trump administration is going to mean more difficult access to high technology, more difficulties for Chinese research students, Chinese postdoctoral students to gain access to American universities, and not only American, even Australian universities. There are areas of research in Australia, you'll be surprised to know, there are areas of research where a student coming from China, if they want to get admission to PhD in, say, for example, advanced artificial intelligence, they need permission from the Australian Home Minister. You can't get admission to an Australian university like the University of Melbourne, for example, if you want to do a PhD in advanced sensor technology or advanced artificial intelligence without getting approval from the Minister of Home Affairs of Australia. So even in Australia, there are restrictions. And same thing would happen in the United States and Japan and most other Western countries. So for China, on technology fronts and on trade fronts, Trump administration is going to mean very, very difficult next 4 years. Now, let's come to India. Alphabetically, we've talked about Australia, we've talked about China. Let's talk about India. Indian government, I think Modi administration is very optimistic that Trump administration will not change things, because the US-India relationship, ever since the transformation of this relationship began under Dr. Manmohan Singh in 2005, this relationship has gone from strength to strength, regardless of who is in power in New Delhi or in Washington, D.C. So we have seen both the Republican and Democrat administrations continue to support the US-India relationship. India has been able to get access to very advanced defense technology. Indian companies are now partnering with American defense manufacturers. India also has access to the most advanced technologies, for commercial use, whether it's in information technology. In fact, many of America's top companies are run by Indians. So India has access to a lot of American technology which China will no longer be able to get access to. Politically, diplomatically, when Donald Trump was president, from 2017 to 2020, Prime Minister Modi got along very well with him. And there is an expectation that that relationship between the two leaders, and in international relations, personal relationships may not be everything, but they are important in foreign policy. And the personal chemistry that exists between Prime Minister Modi and incoming President Donald Trump is going to be important in furthering, in advancing that bilateral relationship. If anything, I think Indian government may find that the Trump administration and the State Department, for example, which publishes all kinds of reports on religious freedom and political freedom, where India has been criticized for democratic backsliding, what the US calls democratic backsliding. US administration has from time to time raised human rights issues with Indian government. Under Trump administration, I think that is less likely. Trump administration is not particularly strong on promoting, universal human rights, even though State Department may continue to publish those reports. But I think India would find that there would be less lecturing from the United States on these issues than has been the case under the Biden administration. There is one area where I think the Trump administration will cause some difficulties for the Indian government, and that is trade. On trade, Trump administration may want greater access for American manufacturers and American companies in India. Now, we know that American companies in the past have found it difficult to compete with Japanese companies and South Korean companies when it comes to consumer goods or cars, for example, automobiles. But I think that's not going to be difficult for India to satisfy the Trump administration's demands, because India is one of the few countries that actually, exports, goods, has a surplus in trade with the United States. But India also buys a lot of, American products, including defense equipment. And defense equipment deals are worth, tens of billions of dollars. So India is likely to continue to acquire American defense equipment, American, Boeing passenger aircraft. Air India and other Indian airlines will continue to buy American passenger aircraft. So even in trade, I think Trump's rhetoric is less likely to bother the Indian government than it is the Chinese government or the Japanese government or the Korean governments.
Wow. Wow. Okay. You actually answered very in detailed, but we will go few bits and pieces into a little bit deeper. Before going there, a kind of a bypass question around it, I better ask it now. How do you see China's depending ties with Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia, like the other countries, impacting global power structure? And what implications might this have for, same, India, Australia, US?
Well, China, as we said earlier, China has become the factory of the world. China produces products for almost every market in the world. You can't go to a store like Kmart or a Target store or a Bunnings store in Australia, if we can use those commercial names. You can't find anything which is made in Australia. Even in the United States, when you go to many of these big department stores, you find that, almost 70 to 80% of the products are made in China. In some cases, even 90% of the products are made in China. So China has developed tremendous capacity to manufacture goods, because China could not have become the factory of the world without developing manufacturing technologies, without developing its workforce, and without creating a supply chain in which China was the central pillar of that supply chain. So China has all of that now. So the fact that China is now the world's factory of the world is not an accident. It has been achieved, that capacity has been achieved in a very systematic way, in acquiring technologies, in even stealing technologies where necessary, in improvising, in developing further on existing technologies. China has been able to become the factory of the world. So that's one area in which China has gained tremendously. The other area is China's capacity to build infrastructure. Chinese companies, Chinese infrastructure companies now dominate the world. Whether it comes to tunneling, for example, tunneling for metro railways or tunneling for building roads in inner city, congested city areas, or tunnels in mountain areas for building roads and railways. Chinese companies have developed tremendous capacity and machinery to build tunnels, and a very significant capacity to build infrastructure from roads, railways, telecommunications equipment, telecommunications infrastructure. China has developed a lot of these capabilities. Now, China also has become the most cost-effective. When it comes to tenders, when foreign governments, whether it's in Africa or in Southeast Asia or in Latin America, when foreign governments put out bids for tender for infrastructure development, Chinese companies usually win those contracts because they are not only promising to build on time, they are also the most cost effective. In other words, they have the lowest bids in many cases for the development of this infrastructure. China is also helped, Chinese companies are helped by Chinese government-owned banks, particularly policy banks like the China Development Bank or the Import-Export Bank of China, which provides financing. So when a developing country government in Southeast Asia or Africa or Latin America wants to build a new piece of infrastructure, they don't have all the capital. They need money. They may have a little bit of savings, but they need capital. So they go to the World Bank, they go to the Asian Development Bank, they go to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is initiated by China, to seek capital. But China says that if you give a contract to a Chinese company, you would be able to get access to financing from China. So whether it's China Development Bank or the Chinese Exim Bank, the Export-Import Bank of China, they would provide you concessional, sometimes concessional, sometimes at market rates, but they would provide you loans for building this infrastructure. So Chinese banks earn interest, and Chinese companies get new projects, new contracts, and make money by building these infrastructure projects. So this is something which is changing perceptions about China in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia. Now, people who use infrastructure built by Chinese companies, they like what they see. They like the infrastructure that they use. And they say that, look, this is built by China. So you can imagine the image of China. It grows in the eyes of the citizens of these countries who are using infrastructure built by Chinese companies with Chinese finance. There is a flip side to it. The flip side to it is that when many developing countries want to build this infrastructure, they go to China, they get loans from the Chinese government, Chinese government-owned banks. Chinese companies, often Chinese government-owned companies, build this infrastructure. Often Chinese banks and Chinese government do not question their capacity to pay back those loans. So because Chinese companies are getting contracts, Chinese banks think that they have a sovereign guarantee, because if they're giving money, if they're giving a loan to the government of a country, the government of that country is giving a sovereign guarantee, right? So they have a sovereign guarantee that this loan would be repaid. Later on, of course, problems arise, as we've seen in Sri Lanka and we've seen in some African countries also, where governments, when the time comes to repay the installments on these loans, when they do not have the capacity to repay, then they go back to China and they say, oh, can you renegotiate the terms and conditions of these loans? And China in the recent past has proven to be a difficult lender when it comes to renegotiating, because China says, no, this is the same thing that happened in Sri Lanka. So there is a flip side to it. What some Indian scholars have called China's debt trap diplomacy. I personally think that the idea that China is lending money simply to trap other countries, I think that is exaggerated, because China would not be able to lend money to these countries if they didn't want to borrow money from China. So if there is a trap, then both sides are getting into the trap, willingly. But the fact is that when many of the developing countries want to build infrastructure, China becomes their first port of call. They go to China and they say, can you please, we want to build this railway, we want to build this highway, we want to build this, telecommunications infrastructure for 4G or 5G. Can you do that for us? Clearly, even though Chinese government says that there are no strings attached to Chinese development assistance, and many of these projects do receive a fraction of the funding that comes through Chinese foreign aid. And like any other country which gives foreign aid, often there are strings attached to it. And I don't think the Chinese foreign aid is very different, because these strings may not be visible, they may not be clearly on paper, but certainly there are understandings. Whether it's about providing access to Chinese Navy to visit their ports, as we have seen in Sri Lanka, or Chinese intelligence gathering ships, the so-called survey ships or research ships. They may be gathering intelligence, and in return for accepting Chinese assistance, countries may be obliged to allow Chinese naval ships or intelligence ships to pay visits to those countries to gather intelligence on their neighbors, for example, right? So there are complications in that. But if you are the leader of a developing country that badly needs infrastructure, who do you go to? Now, in the past, Western countries have offered assistance. But Western countries, their cost of developing infrastructure is much higher than China's. So if America is going to build a bridge in Ethiopia, it's going to cost much more using American engineers, American consultants, and maybe technology from the United States. It's going to cost much more. China offers very cost-effective infrastructure to many of these developing countries. And remember, when people, leaders from other developing countries go to China, they see gleaming new infrastructure, shiny new infrastructure that China has built. When they go to the United States, what do they see? Infrastructure is decaying. I mean, US, of course, US built tremendous infrastructure after the Second World War. But today, United States cities are facing decaying infrastructure. So when leaders of developing countries go to China and they see what the Chinese have done at home, they want China to do that for them. Now, whether the United States, the European Union, India, or Australia like it or not, the fact is that this is the reality. This is why, because of China's capacity as a manufacturer and China's capacity as a builder of infrastructure, many developing countries, whether it's from Africa or from South America or from Middle East and Southeast Asia, they're going to China and negotiating contracts, signing contracts for Chinese companies to build this kind of infrastructure in their cities. What does it mean geopolitically? Geopolitically means that China's influence is growing. China's influence is growing when Chinese companies and Chinese government officials are frequent visitors to a country because they're lending money, they're giving foreign aid, they're building infrastructure. They also gain influence. First of all, it changes perception of China, as I said. The perception of China changes that China is a country that can do it, and it has shown at home that it is capable of doing things. And secondly, it gives China influence. It gives China geopolitical influence. And soon, imports from China, infrastructure projects being built by Chinese companies, lead to collaboration in defense, in military. So many of these countries in Africa, for example, of the 54 or 55 countries in Africa, many of them have civil wars going on, or many of them have wars with their neighbors, sometimes with multiple neighbors. And African armies are also looking to modernize themselves. And particularly those African countries who have raw materials that they export to the rest of the world, they also have the means to acquire weapons and to modernize their militaries. And again, as a weapons exporter, China is emerging as a key partner for many of these countries. So geopolitically, China is gaining influence in Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia. That seems to be the reality. Now, if the West, the United States, European Union, Australia, Japan, if they want to do something about it, they have to be able to offer alternatives to these developing countries. They have to be able to offer alternatives. And we know that the United States, working with the Quad partners, for example, and other Indo-Pacific partners, has developed a number of platforms, number of mechanisms to provide or to build infrastructure. The progress on some of these projects has been painfully slow.
Mm.
And that was predictable. We knew that from the beginning, that it's going to be very difficult for Western governments now to compete with China, largely because of the cost, because the cost of building infrastructure with Western capital, Western technology is much higher than it is for China. India could be an answer. India is a country which is now bigger in terms of population than China. India has overtaken China in terms of population. India's economy is also growing rapidly. Indian companies are also developing capabilities to build infrastructure because India itself is building tremendous infrastructure. But so far, India still doesn't have the scale that Chinese companies have acquired. In China, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of companies from all provinces of China who have developed capacity to build world-class infrastructure, not just in China, but also in other parts of the world. In India, we are still talking about a handful of companies who have that capacity. So, and India's own domestic needs for infrastructure are such that for a while India would not be able to beat China when it comes to winning contracts to build infrastructure. I mean, some Indian companies will succeed, but it won't be able to do it at scale.
Wow. Wow. Very elaborately said that. So let's say from this constipated approach, if we park that you cannot go and do PhD, so it's like all these choking mechanism. In the next cycle, what is China's advantage over India and vice versa?
See, when we talk about nation states, we're talking about two ancient civilizations, China and India. And China and India have their own contributions to humanity. Historically, both China and India have made their own contributions to knowledge. They have made contributions to philosophy, to the world of literature, the world of arts. Both of these countries have their own contributions. And historically, these were two great Asian civilizations, and they have their own impact on the world. Whether we recognize or not, whether we acknowledge or not, the fact is that some of the scientific achievements of countries like India and China have had a bearing on the development of mathematics and science in the rest of the world. So these are two countries which historically have been at the forefront of innovation in many different areas. But that was not necessarily the case over the last couple of hundred years. Over the last couple of hundred years, because of colonialism, because of their own domestic challenges, these countries' contributions in terms of science, technology, they waned. But as these two countries are continuing to grow, China began the process before India. China began its economic reforms in the late 1970s. India began to open up its economy in the early 1990s. And now India is also at a stage where it is perhaps ready to take off, right? So both of these countries are important. But at the same time, they're also competitors. They're competitors. They both want to be both influential regionally and globally. They want to exercise their influence in their own neighborhood, but also globally. So there's a saying in China that you can't have two lions on the same mountain, or two tigers on the same mountain. That there is one tiger that's the king on a mountain. And if we consider this region, the Asia-Pacific region or the Indo-Pacific region, we know that at the moment, the United States is the lion. The dominant power in the Indo-Pacific is still the United States. China wants to essentially push the United States out to become the dominant influence. Chinese government says that we will never seek hegemony, but that's a rhetoric. The reality is that China is working towards becoming the world's most powerful nation. Whether it will get there or not is a different question. But China's goal and ambition is to be the world's most powerful nation, not just regionally, but also globally. And certainly there are areas in which it is doing well. I mentioned earlier China's manufacturing capabilities, China's achievements in quantum computing, in artificial intelligence, even robotics. China is doing quite well. But there is a limit, because if China is going to become insular in its quest to become a great power and its competition with the United States, if China becomes insular, if China becomes more inward-looking, then China will not be able to achieve its goals. So the challenge for China now is that China's success in the last 40 years has been because of decisions made by the Chinese government in the late 70s and early 80s to integrate China's economy with the global economy. China became one of the biggest champions of globalization. And China became one of the biggest contributors to globalization. China was certainly one of the biggest contributors to global GDP growth. But China also began to modernize its military. It was one of the first four modernization goals that the Chinese government has set up in the mid-1970s. In the mid-1970s, Chinese government, even before Mao died in 1976, Chinese government adopted a program of four modernizations. And this was modernization of their agriculture, modernization of the industry, modernization of science and technology, and finally, modernization of defense. And it is that fourth modernization which is now creating challenges, because as China's economy was growing and China did not assert itself in various parts of the world, sometimes in competition with the United States, it was acceptable. But about 10, 15 years ago, the United States government came to the realization that helping China become an economic powerhouse by sharing technology, by giving access to the US market for Chinese companies, Chinese manufacturers, the United States has created a challenger. Challenger not only in economic terms, but also in military terms. And that's where those decisions were made that we are not going to allow China access to our advanced technology, whether it's civilian technology or military technology, or dual-use technology, where there are applications in both military and commercial fields. So China wants to be not only the world's most powerful country economically, China also wants to be the most powerful power militarily. And that is something which is not acceptable to the tiger on the mountain, the United States. The US says, no, we made a mistake by going along with your narrative that you want to open up your economy, you are opening your country, and we supported that. And we supported your economy to develop, quite quickly. But we are not going to do that now. Now we are going to place barriers in your way. And those barriers are both in terms of technology and in terms of military. So geopolitically, this has become a challenging relationship between the United States and China. How this resolves itself is a very important question, because at the moment, it is difficult to say that China will become the number one economy or the number one military power in the world, because China faces some domestic challenges. And the biggest domestic challenge is potentially a challenge to the system itself. So the Chinese political system, the one-party state system, which allowed Chinese Communist Party to win legitimacy through its performance, by developing its economy, by growing its GDP, by putting more money in the pockets of Chinese people, Chinese government earned its legitimacy. Because remember, Chinese Communist Party came to power through a revolution in 1949. So their legitimacy was initially based on the revolution. But then Mao carried out very damaging political campaigns, such as the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s and the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and 70s, which undermined the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. But then Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s, after Mao had died, Deng Xiaoping emerged as China's top leader, and he began to regain legitimacy by focusing on developing China's economy. So he focused on developing China's economy. He said, no, we don't want to have any enemies. We want to be friends with everybody. China wants to open up its markets. Everybody is welcome to come to China to study, to visit, for tourism, or for business. Everybody is welcome. Getting Chinese visa became much easier than Indian visa, for example. And foreigners poured into China to study Chinese language, to study about China. Tourists poured into China to see the Great Wall and the many wonders of China. People came to see China's rich cultural heritage. And foreign businesses came to China to make money, to share technology with China, to manufacture their products in China. And China benefited from all of that. It allowed the Chinese Communist Party to consolidate its power. But as the growth in China weakens, and it has weakened significantly. China is no longer the biggest growing economy in the world. In fact, it is a challenge for China to continue to grow. China could very well stagnate. Japan went through that. Japan had decades of zero growth. China could essentially get caught in the same trap. So if that happens, if Chinese economy doesn't continue to grow, continue to improve living standards of Chinese people, give them hope and aspiration, they would begin to question the monopoly of the Chinese Communist Party on political power. And this is the biggest risk to the Chinese Communist Party. But for them, the number one priority is the survival of the regime. They would not accept anything that threatens their monopoly on political power. Because remember, in democratic system, you have elections. Governments come and go. Governments win elections, governments lose elections, political parties come to power, they get out of power. But in China, because you only essentially have one party, I mean, if I want to be pedantic, I would say that China has 8 other parties. Any Chinese critic would say that China has 8 other parties, but those parties don't matter. The only party that matters is the Communist Party of China. They have a monopoly on power. And the United States, as it takes actions against China on trade front, on technology front, Chinese government will increasingly perceive those attempts as an attempt to undermine the authority of the Chinese Communist Party, to weaken the regime. So China is likely to close its door, not completely close its door, but the door would not be as open as it has been. It will impose more restrictions on its own citizens. It already has in many areas. It would impose restrictions on foreigners' access to China. And that carries the risk of undermining China's economic growth. So Chinese government faces this big dilemma. On the one hand, they want to maintain their monopoly on political power. But on the other hand, they realize that their control on political power is dependent on their ability to deliver improvements in living standards for the Chinese people, for China to become a high-income country. So China can't achieve its objective of becoming a high-income country if the rest of the world, particularly the developed world, says that we are not going to share technology with China, we are not going to give China access to our high-tech products or high technology, laboratories, and also we are not going to give China access to our markets. So Chinese companies which have achieved success in high technology, such as Huawei, right? And most Western governments have now placed restrictions on Huawei in their own countries. So for China now, China is at a crossroads. It has a slowing economy, which could undermine the confidence in the monopoly of the Chinese Communist Party in power. So how does China continue to grow economically and at the same time maintain political control by the Communist Party? That is the challenge for the Chinese Communist Party. So far, the response of the Chinese Communist Party has been that we will prioritize our monopoly on political power. So that we will not compromise with. So that is the number one priority. Even if it means economy slows, we can't compromise on our monopoly on political power. That can't be questioned and that can't be undermined. But if that happens, they will not be able to grow their economy, and which in turn would undermine their legitimacy. That's the dilemma.
Right. Whereas India is in a much open and liberated state from these standpoints.
One of India's advantages is that although there are conflicts in India, India has long-running Naxalite, movement, the Maoist insurgency, and those are systemic threats. These are people, a small minority of people who do not accept the system, who want to change the system. But they are a small minority. Majority of India's population, whether on the left or the right, is not calling into question the whole system. They're not saying they get rid of the parliament or get rid of the constitution. The Constitution of India enjoys widespread support, right? Both from the left and the right. So India is in a good position politically because India has a political system which is much more resilient, much more resilient. India has faced many challenges, political challenges, social challenges, economic challenges, but India is able to meet those challenges without risking the collapse of the system. Indian political system, a democratic political system, and I think the democratic ethos of India, which are part of India's culture, they play a very important part in India's current economic success and India's future economic success. They will play a very important part. If India can continue to maintain the strength of India's political system, India's cultural values, the social harmony between groups, then India is on a good wicket. India is on a very good wicket in terms of continuing to make progress. There is this American journalist who has written many books, Tom Friedman. Tom Friedman, who wrote the book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, and The Earth is Flat. He's a New York Times columnist.
Yeah.
He was once asked this question: how would you compare China and India? And he said, and I still remember his answer, he said, China is like a train or a car which is going on a very smooth road at a very high speed, because China was developing at over 9% for many decades. And he said, China is like a car which is going on a good road at a high speed. India is like a car which is, like the old ambassador, it is going on a bumpy road. But the difference is that the Chinese car is going on a road which has speed breakers. But the driver has no idea where these speed breakers are. These speed breakers aren't signposted. Indian car is going on a road which is full of potholes, but the driver is very familiar with the potholes. He knows how to navigate those potholes. And therefore, in the end, he hopes to get there without too much damage. The Chinese car, it's a good car going on a very good road, but it faces speed breakers, and the driver doesn't know where the speed breakers are. What he was referring to there by speed breakers is this contradiction between China's political system and China's economic ambition. The political system is increasingly looking brittle, not very resilient. Because if the economy continues to slow, it was resilient. In fact, some American China scholars had written about resilient authoritarianism. They had, Andrew Nathan and others talked about the Chinese Communist Party had created a resilient form of authoritarianism. But resilience of the Chinese political system was valid only as long as Chinese economy was growing fast. But once the economy stops growing, or it slows considerably as it has, it faces a risk that the political system may not be able to respond in a resilient fashion as it has been able to do in the past, that the political system may become brittle. That's the risk. India's political system, on the other hand, is quite resilient. So it may be clumsy, it may be sometimes unsightly, ugly in terms of how it settles issues or how it develops things. But in the longer run, it is on a surer footing than a system where there is a fundamental question about the political authority of a one-party system.
Wow. Okay. So we are actually at the end of it. And the last question I would like to ask you, which is maybe because what you're saying, it's a one political party thing, that's why probably, or maybe is there any other answer to it, which is we from outsider cannot see, or China doesn't create any hype of their policy achievements, or whether it is a space or technology. On the other hand, in India, it's like in media, they are declaring their victories all the time. Is it, are India doing too early? Is it from coming from an inferiority, or it's eyewash to their own citizens? How you see it?
India and China, as I said earlier, are very different systems, you know. So when it comes to building an official narrative, um, China has a very controlled system of messaging. The media in China is controlled by the government. In fact, the propaganda department of the Chinese Communist Party controls all messaging, whether it comes from one newspapers or 10 newspapers or one television channels or 50 television channels. Largely, the message is controlled by the party. So there are strict controls on media, whether it is traditional media or new media, social media. There are strict controls on messaging. And nationalism, which is a rising sort of ideology in both China and India. Nationalism, remember there's a difference. I make a distinction between patriotism and nationalism. Patriotism is very different. Patriotism can be very positive. Patriotism could be being proud of your country, proud of your history, proud of your culture. But nationalism is an ideology which is often aimed at somebody else, which is in counter distinction to another power, another country, or another people. So nationalism requires this othering of somebody else. And nationalism, therefore, is an ideology. It's not just the love of the country, it is actually an ideology. And we have seen in both China and India, nationalism has been rising. And ruling parties in both China and India have tapped into that rising nationalism. But nationalism can be a double-edged sword. It can be a double-edged sword. It can support a government, but if the turn against their own government, right? They can turn against the ruling party. Now, in China, the Chinese Communist Party controls nationalist forces in a very systematic way. They allow nationalism to rise to a certain level, but not beyond it. So, for example, if the Chinese nationalists are angry with the United States or with Japan, and they go and demonstrate against outside the Japanese embassy or the American embassy, the Chinese government may allow them to do it for 1 or 2 days. And then it says, no, go back now. That's it. You've done. In India, nationalism is manifesting itself in different ways. In fact, there is a blurring of Indian nationalism and Hindu nationalism. Right? And so Indian nationalism is becoming, for some people, synonymous with Hinduism, Hindu nationalism. And there is an attempt to other those who are not Hindu. Right? So this is potentially, it risks creating problems for India's own stability, India's social harmony. This could create problems. But nationalism is an ideology which is growing in both countries. So when people go and beat the drum about India's great success in everything, often it is mixed with their sense of nationalism. So India achieves one success, commendable success, a genuine success, but then it is exaggerated to such an extent, paraded to such an extent that people begin to question its legitimacy. In China, when China does great things, Chinese are also proud. They also present their success to the rest of the world in a more restrained manner. In a more restrained manner, because Chinese Communist Party is able to control the messaging. Whereas in India, once you unleash those forces, they're very difficult to control. India has 900 TV channels. They are controlled by different proprietors. They have different loyalties, different ideologies. And when they begin to talk about a message, and the journalists who are hired by them, when they start talking about something, they often forget that there's a rational basis for talking about something, and then they are going into completely uncharted territory with propaganda. So in India, we see, it doesn't mean that Indians believe that the average Indian citizen believes in everything that they see on television, but Indian television channels are a word unto themselves, right? So what they talk about, India's achievements, and I'm not here to undermine India's achievements. India has made great strides in many fields. From space to manufacturing to education, India has made some great achievements. But the way they talk about those achievements in China and India differs quite significantly.
Right. Wow. Okay. So on that, thank you, Pradeep ji, for your time, for your explanation. And as you all know, this is, if you want to live your life in your own terms, this is the right place for you. This is URL, Unzip, Reboot, and Leave podcast. On that, we should end our podcast here. Thank you. Thank you, Pradeep ji.
Thank you, Gautam.
Thank you.